Hi everyone, this week we're going to take another look at what's happening in the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic in terms of sustainability. And there's a couple of things I want to focus on. Now last week we took a little look at what was happening with the grain supply, and I do want to spend a bit more time talking about how detailed all of that was. Then I'm going to talk about water maintenance and water supplies, and then I want to talk about sustainability in terms of mining. Okay, so the first topic I'm going to talk about is feeding the masses in Rome. And I had mentioned last week that the Romans gave away free bread and grain to the people, especially living in Rome. And this caused quite a few issues, especially when the population of the Romans kept getting larger and larger, and you needed to feed the masses. Before we look at some of these topics, I want to give you a few things to think about in terms of the living conditions of the poor masses in the Roman Empire. You have to remember that there's no such thing as a social safety net, so there's no Social Security, no retirement, anything like that. And as I put here in the big box, people are really one step away from starvation almost all the time. You don't have unions per se. You had something like unions where people could work in a certain spot in a certain product, but this didn't give them a promise of employment, as I put here. You've got lots of descriptions of slum-like descriptions, especially in the big cities like Rome, where you've got 6-story tenement houses that are about to fall over, very unclean, and so on. In some respects, you've got the people living in the countryside who may have it a little bit better, only in that they can grow their own food. Now, you can probably imagine just the opposite. If the food didn't grow, they would be in some serious trouble. But if you're living in the city and you can't find food and you don't have money for food, I think you're probably in a bit more trouble. The government of Rome was always aware through its entire history that people can revolt and they can cause issues. And as I put here, hungry people are dangerous people, especially to the government. So you find the government spending quite a bit of money and effort into entertaining people, giving them free food, and so on. And it's just for this very reason. Hungry people are dangerous. You also have the issue of the wealthy people taking advantage of the poor. So we talked a little bit about the social structure a few lectures ago, where you've got the rule of the elite or these patrons. These are usually senators, very wealthy people. If you needed money for anything, you would go to them and they would loan money out to you or supplies or something like that with a very high interest rate, which of course would be compounded, and then you'd eventually become one of their slaves when you couldn't pay all this money back, because you get into this terrible loop of having to borrow money for the next year and then borrow money for the next year and so on. And people are really dependent on the goodwill of their patrons. If the patron didn't want to loan them money, you have no money and you can't eat. So it's sort of this vicious cycle. I took this list here of what I've just called other stressors on people. And this is taken from a really good book called Popular Culture in Ancient Rome by Jerry Toner. So I don't know if I've talked about this before, but birth rates or infant mortality was very high, meaning not very many children actually survived birth. And if they did survive birth, they had a really good chance of not surviving to their first couple of years. And what this meant is that women got pregnant more often, and pregnancy is probably the most dangerous time for a woman in the ancient world. It probably still is today, but it meant she had a greater chance of dying in pregnancy, which quite a few women actually did. And then you get disease, fairly common in large cities where you've got the plague spreading through, or cholera or things like that. You've got crime in the cities, and that also in the countryside, but mostly in the city. I've already talked about those tenement houses where you've got overcrowding, which of course then leads to disease and crime and so on. And of course, you all had know about slavery, how terrible that was, and that was certainly a stressor on those. Okay, and just a few more bits of information about what's going on in terms of this free food supply. So we know that as early as 53 BC, people start receiving free wheat. We don't quite know the population in Rome. It really depends on who you're looking at. It can go from everything from 600,000 to 2 million people. And then basing what modern people eat, scholars have tried to go back and figure out how much food each family would need to receive in terms of eating. And so it's thought, somewhere around 900 pounds of grain each year to feed a household. And what they'd end up doing is giving it to the head of the household, which would usually be the husband. And it's thought, maybe you've got 200 to 250,000 people that you're giving away food directly to. Now, I had mentioned this before, the city of Rome was totally dependent on getting grain from outside. And we looked at a few of these issues last week when we talked about deforestation and soil erosion and all the issues that came with that. We do know that the Romans developed a new office to handle this, and the person who ran this was called the Praefectus Annone, or the prefect of the grain. This was created by the first emperor Augustus. And what you see is that they made the laws to give away free wheat to people, and that's mostly done for political reasons. I'll mention this in just a little bit, but to keep the government going, you have to keep people happy, and one way to keep them happy is to give away free grain. And I just talked about the issues of, we don't know exactly how much grain was brought in, but some estimates are anywhere from 135,000 tons to 400,000 tons of grain that needed to be brought in. We do know that it wasn't just the government organizing this. They set out contracts for private grain dealers to bring in grain into the city. And I mentioned this last week, nearly all the grain that's coming into Rome and the surrounding areas comes by sea trade. You hardly have any, you do have land trade or things coming in by land, but it's very expensive. And so, we talked about this last week as well. Rome couldn't rely on its own agriculture. So we're talking about getting grain from North Africa primarily and Egypt. Here's a letter, and you'll have to stop the video to read this. Here's a letter probably from a 2nd century AD emperor about bringing in the grain from Egypt. And it's really interesting. In the last sentence says, it appears that the Nile, answering our prayers, will furnish a flood of the usual measure, and so on. And if you remember a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how important Egypt was in terms of its grain. And now that the Romans control Egypt, they are using the Nile and its fertile soil, if you get the right type of flood, to feed the Romans. Okay, in terms of shipping the grain, so there's lots of things that are happening in terms of economic sustainability with this grain supply. So the Romans were building very large ships and shipping huge amounts of grain. Now we know a little bit about the ships of the Romans because of shipwrecks. So it seems like every year we discover 3 or 4 that have been sunk and sitting at the bottom of the Mediterranean, and they give us a bit more information. And I just mentioned we have this information because of ships sinking. So trade by sea was fairly dangerous, especially in the winter. And it took a bit more effort to get the grain from North Africa and Egypt in the winter, but it had to continue. In terms of getting this grain to Rome, so I just mentioned that you've got almost a private industry set up to bring in the Rome. We do have evidence of companies and people who pool their money, almost like modern day shares, that would then organize to have the grain delivered. So agents were sent out. We've got documents from Pompeii. Now, we're not talking about days of the internet, so we're talking about handwritten notes that are sent by ship back and forth from Rome to North Africa or to Egypt or to wherever they are buying the grain in terms of what the agents who are buying the grain need to do. There are some issues of cheating, but the Romans were pretty good about weighing the wheat and accounting for every pound of wheat that's brought in. So you do have some issues of cheating, but not very many. Now we do know that because of the amount of grain that was needed, the ports along the Mediterranean were highly developed. So especially at a city called Ostia. Now we talked a bit about Ostia last week in terms of deforestation and the amount of debris and soil that comes down the river. It actually was abandoned because of this. But before this, it underwent great reconstruction in terms of being storehouses for grain, and then grain was taken up the Tiber from there to Rome. Now, again, we know quite a bit about what's happening during this period. So the ships are registered, you have receipts. You also have the quality of grain. So sometimes the grain comes with mealworms and all these, nasty things in the grain that will say what's in the grain. So someone will look at it and that will determine its price. And then, as I just mentioned, they move the grain upriver by the Tiber, and they're stored in these things called horia, or warehouses. I'll show you one of these in just a second. You have groups of people who are organized to unload and transport the grain. They're really in something like a guild system. And I've already mentioned shipwrecks and people stealing, so we don't need to go into that again. Okay, and this is an archaeological drawing of the horia, or the storehouses. So I know you can't watch this YouTube video, but I will attach this to our class so that you can actually watch a video on what one of these looks like. But you enter, let me see if I can get my pen working here. You enter through here, and then these are where you'd store the grain, in each of these particular chambers. Okay, you have to ask what type of control was done by the government to make sure that this grain would actually come into Rome and then be distributed. So we haven't even talked about that yet. There's lots of research being done currently on this issue. So, if we're talking about strict controls on grain, lots of discussion. Were there controls on the grain once it arrived in Italy? Again, there's lots of really interesting research coming out in this. We do know that the government did try and control the population of Rome based on the amount of grain that could actually come in. So in 6 AD, we've got a grain shortage. And Augustus, who is the emperor, he starts kicking people out of Rome. So he moves slaves, he moves gladiators, he reduces the amount of his own servants to reduce the number of people who would actually be getting the free grain. So you do have some government control, especially when things are short. And I had mentioned before, if you want to keep people happy, you keep them fed. Okay, in terms of helping the grain merchants, so these people also needed help in terms of, making some money and saving money. So in 19 AD, we know the price of grain skyrocketed. And then what you see is a subsidization, I don't know if that's the right word, being created to help these merchants get the grain in, because think about what would happen if these merchants went under, or they decided to do something else because there wasn't money to be made in grain. Then the Romans would really get hurt in terms of the people living in Rome, who would then overthrow the government. We know that prices rose again in 32 AD, and then you've got Emperor Tiberius doing a couple things. There was sometimes tax relief, and sometimes there were exemptions, and you could read about that in this particular law. Okay, and then I think this is the last slide on the grain issues. Here's a list of primary texts on the grain shortages. So what you've got is like Dio Cassius, you can look up Tacitus Annals, and so on. Okay, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about water use and management in the Roman system, because of course water is a hot topic about sustainability today. How much is out there, how much rain falls, and so on. So this is a really good topic to look at for our class. A few weeks. I do want to spend quite a few of the rest of the slides on talking about how the city of Rome was growing in terms of water use. So of course you need water to live. The population is getting larger and larger. They're building these walls around the city, and with a growing population you have to feed them and they have to drink. So one thing they started to do, which is sort of amazing
technological feat was to build these aqueducts. The first one was Aqua Appia, and as you can see, it was 10 miles long, which is quite a feat in terms of technology, architecture, organization for the government, and so on. This map probably isn't the best. You may have to zoom in on this, stop the video and zoom in, but you can see where some of those sources of water are coming from, and sometimes they are not close to Rome. So they're linking into either lakes or large river systems that do not flow by the city, and then physically bringing in the water. I've made this little chart here showing you some of the volumes of these aqueducts. So if you look at, let me just draw here. If you look at the Aqua Appia, made in 312, you've got almost 3 million cubic gallons of water coming in through this particular aqueduct. If you look at the one that was built in the 270s, you've got a little over 6 million. And then later on, one of the bigger ones, you've got about 6.5 million. And these two were built very close to each other. So what you've got is this massive influx of fresh water into the city, which of course can be used for lots of different things, including agriculture. This is one of the more famous aqueducts. It's from Spain. It comes a little bit later than the time period we're talking about, but here you can see the structure where they have multiple, let me see if I can draw on here, multiple levels, and these arches that are built, and then with these pillars built over the middle to carry the weight, and then the water runs along the top. This is taken from on top of an aqueduct, and as I put here, it's the channel for water, so the water is flowing here. And these were amazing feats of technology. If you think about the slope of these things are like a few inches every once in a while. And so it gets the water to flow down, not too fast, because you don't want water traveling so fast that it's going to crash into where it's going. And of course, you don't want it to go too slow because it won't really do the job that it was designed to. Now, what you're looking at here is sort of a distribution tank. So the water would come into this particular tank, and you can see these holes here. These are where the pipes were. So it comes into this particular tank, and then these pipes lead the water out to wherever it was going. They created a lot of interesting ways to control the water. So one is, I just showed you a reservoir tank. If you think about water that's coming from a lake or a river, you can get a lot of sediment in it. And so you get these things called settlement tanks, where the water is running down, say, and then you have it run into a tank. Let's see if I can draw this. And then the sediment builds up here, and then you have the water continue out through here. So all the sediment's going to drain into this tank, and then you get cleaner water coming down. Water fresheners, what they sometimes do is to aerate the water, they will build, like put stones sort of in the way, so it sort of increases the air to the water, and it makes it a little bit fresher. They use stopcocks to stop the water in certain places and turn it on with more pressure or less pressure. And they also built these siphons, so you're not always going to get an area where you can totally get a downslope from point A to point B. Sometimes it will have to go uphill, and they've created these siphons to push the water uphill. So it's quite a bit of technology to build. Now, what I've got here is a movie I'd like you to watch. And I don't think it's going to play on this particular slide, but I've given you the link here, which you probably don't want to type. But what you can do is go to YouTube and type in Rick Steves Europe, and then it's Provence, France, and then you can type the rest of this. And it gives a really good 4-minute view of some of these aqueducts.
Okay, and now in our last topic, I do want to spend a bit of time looking at raw materials like metals. So what was happening in terms of sustainability? Now, Italy was certainly rich in some metals like iron, but it wasn't enough to keep the economy going, especially when you think about the massive population increase that starts happening in the 1st century AD. So we know they used iron for armor, for nails, hinges, and we just talked a little bit about the food trade and how they would set up companies and private agencies to handle grain. They did the same thing for mining. So the Roman government would sell leases to mine companies, and then you'd get all these natural resources mined out of the earth. When you think about how much was actually mined during, especially the Roman Empire, it's pretty incredible. So statistics from the research are showing 600 million cubic meters of earth moved between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD. This is a massive amount of human effort to do this. They think about 195 tons of gold were extracted during this period, not including things like silver and lead and everything else. The Romans had some pretty interesting ways of getting these metals out of the earth, and it really impacted the way that we do these things today. So most of it was done by something called alluvial extraction, where they would pour water onto the earth, large amounts of water, and then the dirt would move away, leaving the rocks and the minerals. This is sometimes called ruinamontium, or the ruin of mountains, because that's what it would do. They would tear these mountains down, tear these hills down, trying to get to extracting the minerals. I'll show you some pictures. Some of the landscapes are still changed today because of what the Romans did. Now, an interesting sideline of a lot of, especially gold mining, is lead poisoning. And so we'll talk about that a little bit at the end of this lecture. Okay, so much like what you've got with the grain, you have a special procurator that oversees, I should say, mining and the minerals. So most of what I'm going to be talking about, at least in terms of geography, is in Spain. So northwestern Spain, northeastern Spain, there's lots of gold and silver mines. And this is a big reason why Romans were really interested in this particular area and why they took it over. Now, one thing to think about when I'm talking about all of this is we're not just talking about the Romans just digging up pure gold and pure silver and pure lead. We're talking about smelting. And so you need a massive amount of trees, charcoal to get these high temperatures that are needed to get the lead, or to get the gold and the silver and the lead out of these stones. And a lot of times, no big surprise, mines were centers of security because the Romans were dependent on gold and silver for their economy. So this is something they had to deal with. If you want to read about some of the mining techniques, you can look at Pliny the Elder in his book 33. We also know that there's something called open cast mining, which is essentially making a large hole, or you push away the surface dirt and then taking the minerals that way. It's almost like what we do today, where you've got bulldozers that will almost like it looks like a terrace, where they slowly start ripping away the sides of hills, and then they extract the minerals that way. Another really interesting thing that the Romans did that really did a lot of ecological damage is something called hushing, where they would build these massive reservoirs, and I give you the sizes of some of these. Up on these hills, they would sometimes even build aqueducts to fill these, and then they'd open up the doors or the gates of these reservoirs, and a massive amount of water would shoot down and tear down all these hills. This is something that, if you know anything about sort of California history, this is what a lot of the early miners did, where they would shoot massive volumes of water onto the hills. And this is why, San Francisco Bay is kind of polluted, because you've got all these things like lead and, all these toxic chemicals that come away from the earth as you're doing this type of mining. Here's a picture of one of these things. And I forgot to mention that the Romans also did deep mining, where, just like what we do today, they would dig a hole, send someone down, follow the ore lines, and then extract all of that. This is a picture of some of the mines around Las Medullas. And I'll show you an overhead map of this particular area, but you can see some of the issues that we're talking about here, where you can see that they've eroded the land, getting at the minerals. And then this is a map. There's Las Medulas right here. And what you're looking at here, the blue squares are where the Romans mined through solid rock. And then the reds are from alluvial, where you can see a lot of these are moving along riverbeds. And so they'd use the water to help extract the minerals. And then I mentioned today, you can see a lot of devastation or ecological devastation from when the Romans were mining. Here's a place where you can see these arrows where the Romans did some of their mining, and you can still see the damage done today. And then this is just another shot showing pretty much the same thing, where the Romans shot water on these hills and dug into the hills looking for all of the minerals. And then, just to remind you, I talked a little bit about the massive amounts of charcoal and wood that needed. You had to heat up rocks to 600 to 700 degrees Celsius to extract the gold. And then this would lead, and we've got lots of evidence, written evidence from the Romans about how smoky and how terrible it was around these areas because of all the chemicals that were in the air that people were breathing. And then, of course, I mentioned this at the beginning, you do get lead pollution because of mining. We find evidence of lead pollution all over the Mediterranean, and as I put here, there's lead found in Greenland ice from the Roman period. This week, I've asked you to read an article about lead poisoning or lead deposits found in Greenland ice that date to the Roman period. So there was enough mining and things going on that all these chemicals got lifted into the air and then deposited through airflows, especially in the Greenland ice. And then, what you really need to think about too in terms of sustainability and social justice is who's breathing these things. You've got sometimes slaves working in the mines, sometimes prisoners. And then, of course, you have all the people who are living in the local areas breathing all of this smoke and all the lead pollution and so on. And then in this last slide, here's a little bit of scientific data. I took this from an article by Hillman and others titled Lead Pollution Resulting from Roman Gold Extraction in Northwestern Spain. You can find this particular chart on page 1469. And this is really the area I want you to focus on, where you see these large increases in lead deposits. This is bismuth, another offshoot of mining. Now, what's really interesting is if you look down here at the time scale, so this is about 1,000, this is 2,000. Now, I should have put another slide in here. You will actually see lead levels go up again during the modern period and then drop around 2000. And that's because in the 1960s, or I think in the 1970s AD, we started putting lead in gasoline, and that led to higher levels of lead in the atmosphere. And so that was outlawed, and now you see the lead levels going down. But if you look at charts showing the amount of lead being produced by the Romans, it corresponds to modern times.